Back with another video. Hopefully, there aren't any bots in here, which I don't know if I can control that. I wish I could. But, I don't know what this is. A bunch of settings. Can I just set this here? So, recent video with John Barnes and Curtis. It's a good video. I don't know if you guys have watched it, but you should watch it. I've been kind of following some of the stuff Curtis has been making the past couple weeks because he's been making some new stuff. It's been good content. Been interesting keeping the typology juices flowing. They were discussing Carl Jung. They were discussing a little bit of Beebe's model and getting into how different systems define certain things, how socionics would define, TE versus TI, and how in Jungian thought, having external logic correlates with TE. Organizational logic is usually JE function and all that kind of stuff. It was a good conversation. It's also kind of funny listening to Curtis thinking in a meta sense of like his type and thinking about what he's trying to accomplish with some of the videos he makes. And it's like I think SEE does fit for him. Not that he cares or if, that's even debated. But it's just interesting recognizing people doing things their type does. I think SEEs a lot of the time can have that kind of critical mind towards information. It's like inert logic, and also a sense of skepticism about certain taxonomies and what piece fits where and how it fits and if it makes sense or not. It's that kind of, I think you can see this with Joe Rogan. You can kind of see it with Alex Jones, who are both probably SEEs, this kind of skepticism towards the intellectual establishment, basically. That's kind of what they're doing in a sense. There's a intellectual skepticism with gammas, generally speaking, but also you can see how it works with an SEE. Like they don't want to be controlled. This is how it comes off. This is just observations. They don't want to be controlled by some kind of ideological structure. They want things to be reduced to factual, practical information, and they will push on you if you're just a talking ideologue. And it was just kind of interesting to think about, like John Barnes' type. He types ENTPA. I think he had a conversation with Jack. And Jack, at least in that video, had no reason to believe he wasn't an ILE in socionics, which I don't think I would have any reason to believe he isn't either. He seems like it. But you can kind of see the difference between the two and just the way that they talk about information. John gets, some of this is influenced by his academic background, probably, and his religious background. He said he was Catholic, which are also kind of influenced by, classic philosophy, Thomas Aquinas, metaphysics. You can hear that kind of stuff in John Barnes's language. So he's pretty philosophy heavy, which usually corresponds with TI a lot of the time. Doesn't have to be, but you can just hear. And he's also doing certain signals. If we take CT, for example, I'm throwing all this in here too. Of the TI, the kind of meticulous finger thing he's doing, whatever, and just really talking about the dialectic between John Barnes and Curtis was one that was marked by talking about the essence of things versus how things work. Obviously, John Barnes is representing the ontological or metaphysical part, whereas Curtis is kind of getting into the nuts and bolts. Like, okay, how does this operate? Like, and there were certain parts in that video where it seemed like Curtis was almost trying to squeeze out of John something that he could grab onto. Like, John was kind of getting into philosophy heavy, flowery-ish language. And this is just the way that I perceived watching the video. It was a great video. It was just interesting. There was definitely a difference in their respective types in being able to talk about the same subject. Like John wanted to get more into the metaphysical, about the nature of TI, and even though Curtis had questions that were related to the nature of the functions, the way that he was approaching it was a lot different. I think he was really trying to get something simple and but concise out of John, which is helpful. It just goes to show that in the type community, and broadly speaking in any community, you need people that are represented equally, that have different strengths. John is going to get you more into the minutia, not necessarily the minutia, but he's trying to take things at a more fundamental and kind of philosophical approach, trying to get to the essence of things. Whereas someone like Curtis is trying to take all the relevant aspects or parts of different systems and make them clear to people, make them approachable. And he kind of this is kind of his motif in a sense, and I think it's genuine. He's trying to take what each system basically holds to, things that are immediate, that he can share with people, that they have a good grasp of the system. Basically, Ashra said this. Basically, Jack says this. He's trying, and I think he does a good job of representing what they actually hold to. It's not like he's ill-informed. He's been in the community for a long time, so he knows what he's talking about, obviously, and he's a smart dude. And you can tell by that just by listening to the way that he talks about stuff. And so I just find it, now, obviously in the past, he would do some trolly and also entertaining things. And it's just interesting because he seems far more formidable now if he were to debate Jack. But there's a thing about debate. When you're just the skeptic, that's your role in a debate, it loses its, you need to have positive arguments. You can't just go endlessly critiquing something without offering positive arguments. And I think in that debate, he was obviously trolling, I think. I mean, but he's a formidable dude. He could, I think, have a valuable, it would be more of a discussion, not necessarily a debate. But sometimes I think people, when they have objections to socionics, most of the objections I don't really find personally convincing to me, because whenever I'm approaching typology or anything that's theoretical in general, it's like there's not going to be a perfect modeling of the theory, of the thing the theory is trying to articulate. Now, every system is going to have to deal with that in different ways. Some systems fail entirely. Some systems, they don't have a robust system, and so something that could be explained theoretically with some consistent definitions and functionality of the theory, whatever, could actually be explained in a cogent way. Now, there's other systems that try to overexpand into territories where they actually can't account for the things they're saying they can account for, right? When you have some systems that want to get into subtype theory, for example, and they keep subdividing the chart of types like objective personality, and they have racial variants. They're like, this is a black ESTP. It's a subtype of the general ESTP type. And you're like, or he's just black. The difference between these two ESTPs, I've said this before, it's just common sense. One is from Idaho. The other one is from the Bronx. You're like, do I need a subtype component to explain the difference between that variable that's clearly obvious already? They're culturally vastly different people. the question is, do you have to have a theory that explains that difference? No. Why would you have to have a theory that explains the difference between a hood ESTP from Bronx and a freaking potato picking farmer ESTP from Idaho? It's like, no, that's self-explanatory. Now you could argue, you're like, well, that's just a bad system. It's like, why would that be bad? There are certain parts, it's a model of reality. It's not a one-to-one map of reality. That would be a totally different claim. We're saying this is a model of reality. And models are not identical to the thing they're modeling. Hence, they're a model. They represent aspects of reality they're trying to represent, but they're not equivalent. So that's not really a compelling argument. I would love to find arguments. I've heard people make them. I just don't find them personally convincing. I mean, there's things to get into in terms of what definitions are canon. That's fair. Obviously has certain definitions that are probably different than modern socionists do. Which school of socionics do you go with? Right. Okay. That's fine. But pick one. Okay. We're doing WSS, for example. I've read a lot of their material. I don't find... Now, I'm sure that there's areas where I'm unfamiliar with Ashra's definitions of certain things, but the definition of work for TE, the activity of objects, I don't see how that's, as an example, contrast to Jack's definition of TE. I think they're completely consistent, right? You have certain objects, and TE is tracking the dynamics of the object and how it operates in an environment. That's pretty... And it results in logistical thinking. That makes sense to me. I can see this in people. Operational thinking. That phenomena exists in typology, generally speaking, by the energetic, as CT calls it. JE is operational. It's input, it's systematic in a sense. Now, because CT doesn't have the, at least I don't think, I could be wrong, doesn't have the dichotomy of dynamic, a dynamic element, what does that mean? It means that it's not slowing down. It's not going to result in static rules, right? If you're trying to be pragmatic and solve a problem, you're going to go with a solution that's relevant to the situation that may be in contrast to the rules of operations. You have standard operating procedures, SOPs. Those are, if you're met with this situation, do this. Very black or white. But there are novel situations that come out of nowhere that you need to be quick thinking, and you need to create a relevant solution in the moment that might contradict the rules. And then you get into the functionality, the functional component of socionics. Then you have, if you have a TE lead, how do they and why do they ignore TI? It's very obvious. They ignore TI in favor of TE because you can't really do both ways of logic simultaneously. Either you're going to be dynamic and think about novel concepts or novel solutions that aren't articulated in a manual or in a SOP, for example. Or you're going to go by protocol. You're actually going to not do things that are pragmatic because they go against what you're supposed to do normally, right? This is a conflict of interest. These two types of people are vastly different, and their work relations are determined by that difference. You have someone who goes by the book and someone who doesn't. And the one who doesn't go by the book isn't going by the book because the output is better in their mind. They're two different goals. One is compliance and structure, and is trying to reduce all activities to a static output, right? It's like, when this situation comes up, I'm telling you to do what the rule says. This is how you handle, because it's consistent and it's reliable and there's less risk, right? It's easier to organize people if you have rules. It funnels all of their possible activity and work into what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. Makes perfect sense. You could analogize this, not even a word, but analogize, make an analogy out of Law and Order and society. If a cop is only pragmatic, he's going to look at every situation that he pulls someone over as novel. Well, what implications are there? Well, there could be situations where there is something like detaining them is the clear requirement. And if you have a cop who's not principled, then he might overlook those details when he shouldn't. He should actually enforce the law, right? And it could lead to scattered thinking that you have to react and do things differently every single time based on this new situation. So rules, in a sense, organize your own thoughts and your own actions, right? If you're telling me to do X and X comes up, then I do X. What thinking do I have to do there? Nothing. I just have to do it, basically, or not do it. Those are my choices. So there's and I don't mean dimensionality in the socionic sense, but there's a more, this is where the extroverted dichotomy comes in, because TE is more multifaceted in a sense than TI is. Based on what I just said, TE is case by case reasoning. And so if you're always met with a new case, then you always necessarily have to have a new solution. You could say in a sense that if you have a new case that's similar to a previous case, you use the previous solution. Possibly, but let's say you have a novel case and they're always new, randomly generated new situations at work, at home, in society, whatever. You have to be quick on your feet. You have to think more globally about the effects of whatever implemented solution you're getting ready to provide. So you can't just go off of, this is what I'm supposed to do. You have to think about, if I do X, how does that affect everything else down the road? In a sense, or how does it lead me to a high reward or return action, right? It yields a lot of benefit, a lot of fruit if I do this versus that in this given situation. So there's more variables in regards to thinking in a TE sense, in a TE way. There's less variables to act and to create a solution or to think of a solution. With TI, it just, by virtue of it being introverted, by virtue of it being static. So again, like that makes perfect sense to me. Now someone could have another argument and say, well, how clearly can you see this? Can you see this in people? Yeah, I mean, when you're actually applying the theory to real flesh and bone people, your ability to recognize it depends, A, on your knowledge of the system. Obviously, that's true of anything, any system. If you claim to have some theory, if you don't know much about the theory, you're not going to see it in practice, obviously. Two, I lost my train of thought. Actually, signal versus noise. Know what is actually a signal of the theory and what's just noise. If you're thinking that because I have, for example, when we get into the subtype issues, an example of paying attention to noise is trying to track how this hood ESTP is similar to the Idaho ESTP or different or whatever. It's like, that's not staying on signal. You're looking at, well, this guy listens to freaking Tupac and the other guy listens to Darius Rucker, bro. I don't understand. You're like, that's not what, you're not paying attention. You're not focused on the task. That has no bearing on anything. Nothing. That's a culturally relevant detail. That's a super third tier, fourth tier consideration. It's probably not even to be considered at all, really. So with those two ways of typing people, or seeing it practice in theory, or see it in practice, you can see aspects of what socionics is talking about. In some situations, you can see more clearly than in other situations. But you're dealing with real people And so it takes practice, duh, right? Um, and not everything is a signal of the theory. And you have to be able to discern what the theory claims and see examples of that. I mean, I don't. And at the end of that procedure, you actually can have a good idea of someone's type. It's really not, I don't think it's that complicated. But I just say that to say some of the objections to socionics I just haven't found compelling. It is what it is. Like, it's, if I found some, I'll say this. Safsum had some people probably know of Safsum. He's in the type community. He had a critique of socionics. We were talking about, he said something of the effect of like, people's values can change, and if people's values can change, then in theory they could use any function. They could basically change certain elements that they that were unvalued before that they value now. If their values change, therefore their the IME values could change. I never heard that argument before. After thinking about it, I still really find that very compelling, because I don't think people's values change that much. I also don't think, I could equally say that someone that changed their values used their IMEs, their type, in order to change their values. They have the same tools. It produces something different, but they're still using the same means to create a change of values. But I mean, yeah, I don't think people's values really change all that much over time. Not really. I think people become more balanced in life, but I think their values are pretty, once you're like 20, your values at a real level, I don't think they change all that much. I could be wrong about that, but and again, that would just be a movement between their ego to their suggestive. I mean, Hood versus Idaho, LOL. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's just true. I don't get it. But so long story short, that video is good. It's a good video. And I think that Curtis has good points. And I do think that he has good challenges when you get down to the primary sources. Like, is this Jack's articulation of this versus that? Personally, I don't think that there's a vast difference between Oshra's original writings and the stuff that Jack has semantically changed. Also, this narrative of you have to be true to the original source is bogus to me. I don't understand that at all. It's like no advanced school of thought in any context, any domain of information has developed under that premise. It's like, no, you can give honor to people who created ideas, and you should, but is it honorable to build upon what they discovered and then also develop what they discovered? Yes, because they were working with limited information. That would be a disservice to those people to hold to outdated definitions for things if they don't actually bring clarity to people. Now, it doesn't mean you just completely throw the baby out with the bathwater. It just means that you're going to have to make some advancements in the language to fit your current culture, right? Duh. Oshra lived, early 1900s or something? I don't know. Or like the early, the 40s? I don't know. She's old and she's not alive anymore. And because of that, her language is a little archaic. We need to update it. Now, again, like I said, with the socionics Jack's definition of SE, SI, that makes perfect sense to me. Again, now, You can say, well, what are the dynamics here? How quickly could someone flip from one function to the next function? Who would know that? This is the realm of noise. Who would, even if you had, let's just grant this, even if you had brain scans and you did the whole scientific method approach, that wouldn't give you really any more clarity. It would make things more variable and less structured. So you could never have a consistent understanding of the dynamics. All that you would know is that things rapidly change. Someone's moving from their leading function to their role function multiple times throughout the day. If you could do this, right, you couldn't necessarily say why, and you couldn't really, it would be sporadic. It would be very random, and to have any cogent report of what that even means, and that's just one function or two functions turning off and on. That's not considering every function in socionics. Like, because then when you get into the scientific world, then they're going to ask questions of what causes someone to switch off their leading for their role, for example. And then you're going to get into, their diet. When you have a high protein diet, you're going to switch from, it gets into those territories where you're led to complete skepticism, of which you can't make any definitive claim at all. All that you know is all the functions turn off and on rapidly. We don't really know why or what affects it. And that's the end of the story. So no one's going to answer that. Not even science is going to be able to give you a detailed explanation of that dynamic. Yeah, anymore, I don't know who's a bot, so I almost feel like foolish to respond to this. If you are not a bot, I apologize. No, brain scans, what are they gonna track? First of all, they're just corresponding certain parts of your brain with what they think the function is, which is already faulty. And your brain is super multifaceted. And if that's your paradigm of correlation between parts of the brain and a function, then you're not going to have actually a type, because your brain chemistry, your brain activity is going to be affected by a massive amount of variables that are dependent on the day. They're dependent on the diet. They're dependent on your development, your age. They're dependent on your life circumstances. And so in theory, your type would change literally every day. Now, could you at the end of someone's life, with all that data, aggregate some common topography of their brain activity? I guess, but who's doing that? Nobody's doing that. That doesn't even make sense to do. So yeah, that's that whole thing with Nario Darty. It's like, or Dari, whatever his name is, Dario Nardi, something weird. It's that whole thing. It's like there's massive flaws in this. Basically, the ones that I just listed. And also, how do you know it's the type that has this specific brain topography or mapping? Could this not just be intelligence or the lack thereof? How do you know that certain variables are actually causative of their type? You don't. First of all, you can't demonstrate or draw a connection to certain hemispheres necessarily, because they involve they would involve multiple parts of multiple functions. The prefrontal cortex, decision making. Okay, every element makes decisions. That's not helpful. It's like the left hemisphere is about logic. Okay, well, what about a subdivision of the left hemisphere that's more specific than just it's about logic? Is that multiple elements working together? Yes. What could you consistently draw from that? What conclusion could you draw from that? Not really anything. Not anything compelling or worth listening to, in my opinion. I'm kind of crapping on this, but I don't mean to. It's just, you know. So, I like the video. I kind of sound like I don't. I'm just in real time engaging with these thoughts as if someone's asking. No one is, but I'm acting like they are. Potential prefrontal is more about planning, action. Yeah, I mean, I guess. I thought prefrontal cortex, I thought it was about decision making. I thought it was about executive functioning. But either way, whether it's about planning, okay, well, in order to create a plan, you have to use what? You could use a bunch of the elements to do that, is the point. Yeah, and the motor cortex, do you ever act without thinking or vice versa? Do you ever, is there ever a point in which when you're doing a task or you're acting in some sense, you're willing in effect in the environment, are you not thinking about that? Does that not include logic at all? When you're performing duties at your work, you are in the process of using motor cortex, body functioning, just to move and do things. But the job that you're actually accomplishing entails logic. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to produce anything. So, at some level, and obviously more sophisticated tasks require more logic. Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was a great video. I thought it was a good discussion. Like there's acting without thinking happens from midbrain and basal ganglia. Parts of your spine have neurons that will respond before a signal gets to your brain. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely things that you do unconsciously, certain habits that you are just conditioned to do without thinking. But there's also certain things that you use your motor cortex to accomplish that do require thinking. And that's already getting into a combination of sensation and logic. Now, that kind of proves my point that when we get into more subdivisions of how the brain actually functions, you get more and more complicated. And therefore, when you're trying to draw a connection between certain parts of the brain and how it correlates to certain IMEs or functions, then you're getting into a legitimate dynamic between those parts of the brains and their function and the functions and the IMEs. So you have a combination of functions working together, right? Okay, now we're being good scientists and asking what causes that part of the brain to light up? What external stimuli? Now, if it's unconscious, you still have some level of external stimuli. It could be something, your alarm going causes you to wake up, causes you to get into the cycle of your habits for the day, brushing your teeth, filling your water bottle for work, driving to work, whatever. But there are so many variables just in 1 hour of waking up that would be loaded with functional dynamics already. How you could ever produce a single type from that premise is absurd to me. You wouldn't be a single type. You would be you would have a daily type, basically. And you could even call it a singular type. You would have an hour by hour topography, I guess you could say, of your brain lighting up in certain semi-consistent patterns, I guess. It would only be consistent the further you look back, right? The longer you have, the more expanded in time you have the information, right? If you assess someone from 2005 to 2030, and you were able to do brain scans literally every single day, every minute of the day, you could draw some kind of connection. First of all, no one's going to do that because that's stupid and that would cost too much money. That's absurd. That would be retarded to do that. But in theory, you could do that. And then you're asking things like what causes their brain to light up in these ways. If you have external factors, the external factor isn't your type. The external factor is something completely outside of your brain. like your alarm going off. So you couldn't have a type. You could have a semi-consistent day-to-day brain map of the way your brain lights up for that day. And essentially, if all things are consistent, you could have that type. You know what I'm saying? Like, damn near constantly. Yeah, okay. Motor things consisting of what? Do you do stuff at work and you don't think? How do you produce anything? Yeah, I agree that there are unconscious things that you do that are habits. But if you're working and you're using that part of your brain that causes action, how do you accomplish a task if you don't reason about what you're doing? If your job entails talking to other people and they ask you questions, do you mumble? Do you not speak? How do you, all of that is, necessarily entails thinking. You couldn't do the job. Now, are there certain parts of your job that you're not thinking as much? Of course there are. Potentially, it depends on what you do. But if you're in a factory, for example, and you're, you know, loading a bunch of pins in a box or taping boxes, whatever. But even that, let's say you have 2 batches of pins and you put one pin in one box and another pin in another box. There's no point at which you're discerning rationally the difference between, even if you consciously recognize it, you still have a level of thought that's almost even more, it's more implicit. You're making identification between 2 objects, and you using your eyes and your senses, but there is still at some base level what do you want to say, categorizing the 2 different objects in order to put them in the correct box. You are doing thinking at some level, whether it's low level or a high level, depending on the task. Both motor cortex and logic are necessary to accomplish anything. They are. Don't need to think it out first. I just instinctively say or do and do what is correct. Yeah, there's no way. Like, you just instinctively do what you're supposed to do. Yeah, that doesn't follow at all. There's nobody that does that. Are you a robot? This might confirm that you're a bot. Maybe this is how I determine. Think consciously, it creates trouble. So actually, you shouldn't have responded because you thought consciously, and now you're in trouble. You should have just not said it. Actually, this is the first time doing something you have to learn. Okay. I like the video attempt, but not the discussion so much. I tend to really dislike the flowery, ungrounded philosophy stuff that you mentioned. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I find it somewhat interesting, but yeah, you can get into territories where you don't know what you're talking about. Like, you're just kind of like, can you give me something that I can grab? And that's what Curtis was doing, which was good because it did kind of try to get John Barnes like, okay, bro, how do we take your analogy of the chair and these very metaphysical distinctions, external, internal, you know, what is the chair? What is the cup? What is it composed of? SC is thinking about what I can, in his terms, like what I can do with the cup, versus SI that's thinking about maybe how the cup feels in their hand or the aesthetic of the cup, right? He has these dichotomies that he's using in order to kind of talk about the phenomena of the cognitive functions. And he's obviously has a background in philosophy, so that's kind of why it happens, but I get your point. But yeah, I mean, I think Curtis is he can make things pretty simple and clear for people, and take some of this complicated material and make it, simple and, to the point. People can grab it and use it, which is helpful. We have a lot of flowery people in the community that say a lot but nothing at the same time. And that just gets old. I get tired of listening to that too. I'm like, can you just get to the point? What? And I know I can spurg out. I definitely spurg. But yeah, people just try to have different ways of talking about the same thing over and over and over again. So yeah, it was a good video. I kind of enjoyed it. I could see the difference, one, between their type, and I thought that was pretty interesting. And something else I was going to say. Barnes, another philosophy to try to explain this. Yeah. Yeah, he might not be, but he definitely has an interest in philosophy. Again, I think I attribute this to his Catholicism of, Thomas Aquinas is a very famous like Catholic philosopher theologian who was interested in metaphysics, the nature of things, asking those very TI questions. What is a chair? What is chairness, right? When we get into that aspect of ontology, substance of things, what they're composed of. You get into dichotomies like the dynamic, static dynamic is a very metaphysical distinction. He has kind of a natural interest in philosophy, and I think sometimes that can make the conversation of socionics or Jungian philosophy or psychology more vague, because philosophy can be vague, especially metaphysics, and Jung was vague. So you combine the two and you get a cloud of mystery, and you have no idea what the person's trying to say. But he did try to do that, explain one philosophy with another one, and if you don't have interest and or knowledge in philosophy, it's just babble. Not to say that it wasn't valuable. I think he had good things to say, but that's the one thing that I've learned about most Jungian schools of thought. Yes, like you said, it means that the conversation never gets grounded into anything relatable. Clearly. Yes, that's definitely it. Yeah, and some people, it's just really, I think TI versus TE is a very big example of this. I think you can struggle with intuitives talk like this versus sensing types don't. A lot of the time, it's a very practical way you could go about finding out someone's type is their lexicon. Generally speaking, how clear are they? What's the content of what they're normally talking about? If they're normally talking about esoteric, mystical phenomenology, well, that's probably someone that's not very grounded in reality. Probably. By definition, they're not. So now, do you run with that and conclude that they're not an intuitive type, or they are, or whatever? No, that's a signal that's leading me into inquiry. And then from there, I can ask questions to confirm or deny my initial idea. Yeah, that would be a proper way to go about that. Now, again, there's circumstances. Someone could just be naturally interested in philosophy, or they have a background in it, or whatever. Like, that could affect things, but their communication style was very apparently different. Curtis was very concrete, very to the point, found himself trying to ground everything John was saying in something relatable and clear, and trying to bring that analogy back to the ground constantly. Whereas John was trying to do the exact opposite. They started off clear when they started their conversation about the topic, and then the more that John spoke, he's starting to get further and further away from the initial context of the conversation into analogies, metaphors, into metaphysics, ontology, the nature of things, philosophically speaking, rather than how can I actually identify this in real life and how does it work? How does that concept demonstrate itself in reality? And that's the value of concepts in general. It's like if something doesn't produce real world effects, then the concept really doesn't have much cogency. It's not convincing. It needs to actually show evidence of itself in order for it to be implemented into your system of thought. If it doesn't, then it's useless, and there's no need for it. It doesn't solve any problems. It almost doesn't exist. It has no effect. It changes nothing. It does nothing. It doesn't, right? So there's a tendency that some types have to get very abstract and never come down from that. That's a type thing that I generally can't stand. It is a type thing. I tend to see that as someone that doesn't actually know what they're talking about. You have to have diffuse, unspecific language because you're incapable of understanding the topic well enough. Yeah, I think to some degree that's true. I think there's also people that just generally speak that way, and if they were to test on the subject matter, they could get an A easily, because their way of talking about what they know is different from someone else's way of talking about what they know. And I do think, generally speaking, a good teacher is able to explain something they know simply so that all people, regardless of how they think, can come to understand that topic. But yes, oftentimes it's kind of someone who thinks that they're smarter than other people, and they can see what they can almost see what they're talking about in their mind, but they don't know how to externalize it. They don't know how to transmit what's in their brain, what they're talking about, and place it in someone else's head, which requires a medium of logic. It requires language, precise language, to take an idea that I have, communicate it in such a way that you can see the same idea, right? That's the value of communication, broadly speaking. Like, if you're trying to communicate with someone who doesn't know your language, then you're not really going to communicate much. If you're trying to teach someone in a language private to you that only you understand, then your teaching has no merit or value at all, nor the ideas. The ideas go to die, unfortunately. They might be good ideas. They might be interesting. They might offer solutions. They might be compelling. But if you can't teach them or someone can metabolize them, then there's no value for them. Literally, they just die. So knowing your audience, knowing how most people are going to receive what you're saying, knowing whether the people you're talking to have a base knowledge of what you're saying, should put the responsibility on the communicator to change their language in order to make it make sense to most people, which is a skill too. You could obviously develop that. And you just have to figure out how to. Most people don't think about that. Most people don't think when they're communicating something that they bear the responsibility to make it understandable. Now, you might be working with someone who's dumb as a box of rocks. That exists. I don't think most people are necessarily actually dumb. I think most people are obviously average intelligence. Doesn't mean they're dumb, doesn't mean they're super bright. It just means that you need to work in order to make it clear to them. And it's also relative to the content that you're trying to teach. If you're trying to teach a super complicated theory or topic, obviously you're going to have to put a lot of work into making it very simple. Obviously, even more simple than you'd probably imagine you need it to be. But, there's professors I've had in school, teachers, that just suck at this. They're talking about something that they know the ins and outs of, but they can't really dumb it down to where you can see the fruit of it. And then no one cares about it. No one gets excited about what you're talking about. It's just, yeah. Seems like intuition. They see it before they can speak of. Yeah, exactly. It is. It is intuition. Now, there's different forms of intuition and different functions of intuition, depending on the type. But yeah, it's definitely intuition. And that would point to the shadow of what should be integrated learning language. You'll notice that these same individuals don't have the professional background that gives you the reassurance that they actually know what they're talking about. Yeah, I mean, true. Definitely. The classic I knew you were going to say I giving a sense of academic brilliance, but in fact has no proven expertise or interest in acquiring that expertise. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of them. Some of them recognize that about themselves and they try to work hard, like Trey, for example, to be clear and not to speak flowery. Other ones, most IEIs I've seen, they don't care. Obviously, they're like, if you don't get me, it's because you're just dumb. It's like, or here's a novel idea. You're actually dumb. And you think you can talk about metaphysics or transcendental whatever without picking a book up on the guy who actually thought of it first. Have you ever thought about that? Maybe read what he says and then let's hear what you say. You're sensing you. Potentially figure out what it is they even think. Yeah, I mean, most people, would have to do that to a certain degree. Like, that's what my dad always told me. He always told me, think before you speak, which I don't usually do that very well. I'd rather just speak. And then as I'm speaking, I'm thinking. And I have things that come out, and, it can create problems sometimes. But, yeah. But that's a very clear division between sensing types and intuitive types. But obviously, you have intuitive types that are high in logic, others that aren't. And so out of the bunch, they would be the ones that actually can take the novel concept or philosophy and relate it to everyday things. Give analogies that actually make sense, relevant analogies that someone would grasp. But oh, dude, my back is on fire. But yeah, long story short, go watch the video. I haven't finished it yet. I need to. It was a good video. I think it's cool to have people that are in the community that have different presuppositions about Jungian theory, and they have a conversation about it, and they try to figure out, well, this author says this, that author says that. What are the similarities? What are the strengths of this position over and against that position? Like, that helps everybody. It also helps non-socionic schools of Jungianism, whatever. Like, they can equally benefit from that because it's nailing in what they actually believe, what their claims actually are, what their system actually is comprised of. And then you can ask whether one system makes more sense than the other system from that. I mean, that's, but whatever. There's a reason why I tend to like dislike II types. Yeah, they can be interesting. They can be interesting. Yeah. But all right, guys, I've went on way longer than I thought I was going to. So you should watch that video. Let me know what you think. And yeah. All right, peace.